I'm not gonna lie, year debates in FNaF drive me nuts. I generally think they're unimportant and largely redundant. You know, knowing the exact chronological placement of each game rarely ever changes how we interpret the story. Does it really matter when sister location takes place if we already know it falls somewhere in between FNaF 1 and FNaF 3? No, not really. It could occur in whatever year Scott intended, and as long as it fits within that narrative space, the exact number doesn't change much. So why does it even matter? Honestly, it really doesn't. Okay, that said, if we are going to talk about timelines, I think it's worth looking at FNaF 3 more closely. Unlucky for us though, the FNaF 3 Steam description is super vague. It only mentions the closure of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza without clarifying which one. And if you know literally anything about FNaF, you know there were many closings. The MCI in 1985 led to a shutdown, and then there was the Bite of 87, which likely triggered another one, and then of course the final closure is implied in FNaF 1, whenever that happened. You know, depending on your theory, that could be in 1989, 1992, 1993, 1995, 1998, and even 2000. But yeah, those are a lot of dates. Given how the description is worded, it opens two very different possibilities. Either FNaF 3 takes place 30 years after a Freddy's closed, or it takes place 30 years after the final Freddy's closed, the one we see in FNaF 1. But here's the thing, right? And I really have to say this. We are probably overcomplicating this. We have to remember that this Steam description was written by a guy who very clearly didn't care much about how he wrote things. The FNaF 1 newspapers are infamous for being riddled with grammatical errors, awkward sentence structure, and literally missing basic apostrophes. This is not someone who was obsessing over precision. So I do genuinely think the answer to this whole which closure debate is actually very simple. We're looking for narrative intent, not flawless documentation. That said, I firmly believe the description is referring to the 1985 closure. Why? Well, it's simple. The FNaF 1 newspapers. They overwhelmingly refer to the events in that specific pizzeria, and they mostly describe the restaurant's reputation in 1985 post-MCI. Those newspapers talk about how Freddy's was struggling to stay open and how parents began pulling their kids out of parties. It was very clearly illustrating the beginning of the end for Freddy's. So when the FNaF 3 Steam page talks about a Freddy's Pizzeria closing and directly refers to, quote, the events that took place there, I think it's pretty obvious it's referring to the MCI location in 1985. Those animatronics were haunted. That pizzeria had history, and more importantly, it had a mystery. The perfect recipe for a horror attraction 30 years later. And let's not forget the central premise of FNaF 3. It's an anniversary, a 30-year anniversary. I don't know, I've always thought that number was very specific. It's not a clean 25 or 50-year anniversary. It's 30 for some reason. The return of William happens precisely when it's been 30 years since the horror began. And when did the horror begin? When the murders happened in 1985. But okay, no, I hear you. The MCI wasn't even really explored until the Silver Eyes was released in December 2015, a whole 9 months after FNaF 3 was released. But to that I say, yeah, a whole 9 months. It takes a long time to publish a book because it includes an initial draft, rewrites, editing, pitching, and then the actual publishing phase. It's a whole mess. But that timeline also gives Scott plenty of time to sit with his ideas and figure out where exactly he wants to take the story. But that's not all. Get this, FNaF 2 was released on November 10th, 2014. Just 3 days later, on November 13th, Scott's website updated to display a single word: offline, until you brightened the image and revealed the hidden message, until next time. Obviously, that undoubtedly suggests that even at this early stage, Scott had a sense of where he wanted to go with the story. He was literally teasing it 3 days after FNaF 2's release. And it's not just website Easter eggs either, right? In FNaF 2, Ralph, the phone guy, directly references Fredbear's, saying it was closed for years, and even talks about the quote, old location location, which was plagued with a ton of negative rumors. A place that was, quote, left to rot. That's an obvious allusion to the MCI location and to the incident itself. When Scott was developing FNaF 2, the old location could have easily closed in 1987 or even as early as 1986, but no, it was specifically said to have been left to rot for quite a while. And then coincidentally, under the context provided by the SOLVES, we finally understand why. The MCI, which occurred in June 1985. Then conveniently, in the very next game, FNaF 3, we get those secret minigames involving 2 golden animatronics accompanied by vintage training tapes narrated by none other than Ralph. These same tapes explain the dangerous springlock suits, specifically the same kind William wears in FNaF 3. The tapes talk about how the suits could be deadly if misused, and even how Spring Bonnie was noticeably moved. That is a direct reference to the MCI, and all of it in combination heavily suggests that Scott already had a plan for where this story was headed. The SOLVES didn't invent the MCI, it merely solidified what had been building for a while. Yes, the original novels and the games exist in disconnected continuities, but you cannot deny the fact that they share almost every single aspect that makes FNaF recognizable. I definitely don't think it's a coincidence that in an anniversary game all about springlock suits, direct references to the MCI, and tons of minigames designed to finally put the MCI victims to rest via Happiest Day, in what was meant to be the concluding chapter of the trilogy, we just so happen to get what appears to be a direct reference to the only other confirmed closing of a Freddy's location. And think of it like this. We hear directly from Ralph that management instructed work crews to build a false wall over the safe room. This comes right after he mentions the yellow Spring Bonnie suit being moved around in the safe room during the time of the MCI. Then, not long after that, the pizzeria shuts down because of the MCI. And now, what do you know? 30 years later, after some tragic closing, the owners of the attraction just so happen to discover Springtrap in a sealed off safe room. It all lines up perfectly. Again, remember that this is the same game that is the host to the Follow Me minigames, which literally recreates how William performed the MCI. This is Scott visually confirming what really happened in 1985. So with all of this, the springlock suits, the closure of Freddy's, Happiest Day, and a scene-by-scene depiction of the MCI, we're supposed to believe that the year this all takes place is based upon the completely ambiguous setting of FNaF 1 instead of the one moment in the series tied to an exact date and time? If so, why the heavy emphasis on the MCI that took place in 1985 that caused the pizzeria to shut down? I mean, just think about what Scott was probably thinking while developing FNaF 3. He had already established this mystery about the infamous missing children incident, which he knew for a fact took place on June 26, 1985. So now he's making a game that's meant to happen after some kind of anniversary, one that would obviously carry narrative weight. And instead of making a game that takes place 30 years after the MCI, which would have landed it right in 2015, the year the game was released, he for some reason sets it 8 years in the future for seemingly no reason? Think about it. The only reason the community believes FNaF 1 takes place in 1993 is because of MatPat's original theory linking the game to the real-life Chuck E. Cheese murders from December 1993. That's it. His minimum wage theory only ever hinted at the 1990s. It never pinned down a specific year. So the very year we're basing FNaF 3's placement on is itself built on shaky ground. And the worst part is, even a whole 10 years later, the only strong lead we've gotten to pin down a year came from the week before. And even that was just a passing reference to Ralph's daughter, Capelia, owning a Sega Genesis, a console that was released in August 1989. So even with that, we're barely teetering into the 90s. It's not by any means a rock-solid foundation to build a timeline on. So I ask again, why would Scott anchor the timing of FNaF 3 to a year that's already so loosely defined, when the alternative is defined down to the exact day and even time of day, the evening of June 26, 1985? People often say that Scott confirmed that the community solved FNaF 1 through 3, but that's not exactly what he said. Here's the actual quote. Just right off the bat, notice how he says game theory got almost everything right for FNaF 2, and that the story was only, quote, uncovered. But at this time, remember, MatPat was still claiming that phone guy was the purple guy, which we know to be factually untrue. So if Scott considered that theory, quote, almost right, then there's definitely room to interpret his praise as generous rather than definitive. It's entirely possible he knew the community got the date of FNaF 3 wrong, but still acknowledged they were close overall when the game first came out. And isn't it strange how we never actually knew the name of the killer? How Scott always said MatPat was almost right, but never outright confirmed that the phone guy was the killer? It's almost like, just maybe, the real killer was William Afton, a character who wasn't even introduced until the Silver Eyes. Keep in mind, the name William wasn't confirmed in the games until Sister Location, which came out a full year after FNaF 3. Okay, now back to the timeline. Some people argue that the FNaF 3 Steam page could be referring to the year we play FNaF 1. And yeah, there's that cryptic teaser source code from Scott's site that read 5 Nights at Freddy's 30 years later, only one. Some interpret that to mean FNaF 1, 30 years later, only one animatronic. But I think I disagree. To me, those commas make it read like meta tags, like search terms. They're not a part of a sentence. They're like descriptors. For some reason, many people seem to believe that the original string of text didn't include the commas, and that it simply read 5 Nights at Freddy's 30 years later, as if the gap was directly referencing the first game. But that's just simply not true, and it never was ever. The actual source code uses commas to separate each word individually, so the idea that the phrasing confirms a direct timeline from FNaF 1 is just based on faulty reading. They likely reflect the same vague sense of 30 years later the Steam description does, deliberately unspecific. Okay, but still there's yet another snag, right? The box of animatronic shells in FNaF 3. The Steam page refers to, quote, empty shells, which seem to resemble the toy animatronics from FNaF 2. Surely that complicates things. If those were recovered after, quote, decades of neglect and ruin, then it could be referring to how it was collected after the FNaF 2 location shut down, placing FNaF 3 in 2017. But just take this newspaper in FNaF 3 for example. Local amusement park is getting ready to scare your socks off with a new attraction based on the unsolved mysteries of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. That single phrase, unsolved mysteries, isn't arbitrary. The only event ever described in that way is the MCI. The original FNaF newspapers explicitly state that the bodies were never found, and they call it a tragedy that happened many years ago. Unsolved mystery doesn't describe a business failure or a bite incident. It describes the MCI. And that kind of wording just so happens to show up again in the FNaF 3 Steam description. It talks about the events that took place there. No year is given, no specific game is referenced. Just Freddy Fazbear's Pizza in its purest, most recognizable form. Specifically not the new and improved Freddy's from FNaF 2, but the original. Then we get to the ultimate guide, which gives us this line. Set 30 years after the horrific events that took place at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, though which specific events we're not sure, this game operates on two disturbing levels. That's explicitly framing FNaF 3 as taking place 30 years after a defined event. And that phrase, horrific events, has only ever consistently been used in relation to the MCI. But here's where things start to get messy. On the very next page, the ultimate guide appears to contradict itself. It suddenly claims that FNaF 3 takes place, quote, 30 years after the last Freddy Fazbear's Pizza closed its doors. At face value, that could seem like a shift toward the FNaF 1 timeline. But let's just take a closer look at what the book is actually saying. It says, quote, the new phone guy explains that it's been 30 years since the last Freddy Fazbear's Pizza shut down, and a company is trying to capitalize on the restaurant's gruesome past by launching Fazbear's Fright, the horror attraction. Admittedly, that sounds pretty definitive until you actually listen to what the new phone guy says in FNaF 3. Because here's the truth, the new phone guy never says that. He talks about how the attraction is drawing on Freddy's legacy, sure, but he never gives a time frame. He never mentions 30 years, and he certainly doesn't establish a date. The guide is either paraphrasing wildly or just misremembering. And just to really drive the point home even further, let's just talk about Felix the Shark. One of the stories, You're the Band, paints a picture of a world where, during the time the story takes place in, Freddy's as a franchise has all but disappeared in the wake of that tragic incident said to have happened 30 years ago, literally placing the story in 2015. Sound familiar? Well, it should, because it's clearly echoing the setup for FNaF 3. And if Scott or his writing team really intended that 30-year gap to follow the FNaF 1 closure, then why are multiple external sources continually reinforcing the MCI as the pivotal event? And that even has massive, yet honestly satisfying effects on the timeline. It's widely theorized that Into the Pit takes place at the earliest in 2018, and at the latest 2020 or 2021. And this lines up beautifully, because when the Stitchwraith showed up in Into the Pit, it's implied by its presence that the events of Pizzeria Simulator have already happened, and not just yesterday, but years ago. So this gives the Stitchwraith at most 5 years to exist, or at minimum just 1. That to me is a pretty clean window to work with. It even gives ample breathing room for all of the stingers to unfold. But what about HRY223? HRY obviously means Henry. I don't think I need to spell that out for anyone. This cassette man, who is an old friend of Williams who built the classic animatronics, has a daughter who possesses an animatronic after being killed by William in 1983. And to be fair, the character encyclopedia goes out of its way to name drop Henry and Charlie in Pizzeria Simulator. But then what the hell does 223 mean? And honestly, I have no idea. And I don't think anyone else does either. On one hand, literally no one besides allegedly Scott has ever abbreviated 2023 as 223. That makes no sense whatsoever. People often say that this is akin to Scott's clarification about FNaF 4 taking place in 1983. But like, how? That just straight up gives us the year. It's not even ambiguous. Even the FNaF AR emails did it better, with Vanessa's username being Nessie97. If Scott's intent was to clarify that the game takes place in 2023, why not just say it takes place in 2023? HRY23 or HRY2023 makes way more sense. It's especially funny because another popular interpretation of the 9 and 7 in Nessie97, an interpretation spawned out of Vanessa being born too soon because of the assumed 2023 date, is that it refers to Vanessa's birthday in September. But just look at the structural similarities between Nessie97 and HRY223. Both are abbreviations of their respective names, Nessie being a nickname for Vanessa and HRY being short for Henry. They're literally the same thing. So if 97 is short for 1997, that means 223 can't mean 2023 because it's not abbreviated in the same way as 1997. And if 97 supposedly stands for September 7th, then why can't 223 represent February 23rd? And let's be real here, no one abbreviates September 7th as 97, especially when used in usernames. Similarly, no one abbreviates the year 2023 as 223. If that number were meant to represent the year, it would just be 23. It always is. Let's just say you're in school and you're writing the date. Say it's May 6th, 2023. You're gonna do 5/6/23. You're not gonna do 5/6/223. That doesn't make any sense. Like, just imagine for 1 second. Go all the way back to FNaF 4, right? You walk up to the TV in the Afton house, and instead of it saying 1983 at the bottom, it just says 983. Or imagine Vanessa's username was Nessie997 instead of Nessie97. Would anyone, and I mean anyone, seriously try to argue that it was meant to say 1993 or 1997? Of course not. That would be absurd. No one shortens 1983 to 983, and no one abbreviates 1997 as 997. So then why is 223 suddenly allowed to mean 2023? It's inconsistent, and it's only ever entertained because it props up a theory people already want to believe. But then again, how would one abbreviate Henry? HRY is kind of perfect in that regard. So if we accept that, then maybe 223 is shorthand for 2023. And if that's the case, then I guess Pizzeria Simulator could take place in 2023. But does that really work? Things start getting really sticky when you try to accommodate the stingers and Into the Pit. If Into the Pit really does take place between 2018 and 2021, then we've got a problem, because the Stitchwraith only becomes possessed possessed by Jake, Andrew, and William after the man in room 1280. And that story only happens years after the Pizzeria Simulator fire. So if Pizzeria Simulator happens in 2023, there's not enough time for any of that to make sense. And I just don't buy the idea that the Stitchwraith's appearance is just an Easter egg. Seriously, fetch to be beautiful and count the ways. Those minigames are all wildly accepted as lore relevant, directly tying into their respective Fright stories. And we're supposed to believe that the one thing connecting all of these stories, the Stitchwraith, is the part that doesn't matter? How does that make any sense whatsoever? If everyone's wrongly assuming Into the Pit takes place before Pizzeria Simulator, then why would the developers, who explicitly said there are lore relevant Easter eggs in the game, put a Stitchwraith sprite outside of Oswald's window? Like, please tell me, what other purpose would placing the Stitchwraith outside of Oswald's window serve if not to imply that Into the Pit takes place after the Stitchwraith becomes possessed? I'm sorry, I'm just not buying it. Not when people are quick to use Trash in the Gang appearing at the mill as evidence that Into the Pit happens before Pizzeria Simulator. Those are literally garbage props Michael can buy in Pizzeria Simulator. If anything's an Easter egg, it's that. So why are we giving Trash and the Gang more narrative weight than the Stitchwraith? Just think about it. In Pizzeria Simulator, Trash and the Gang is acquired from Dumpster Diver Weekly, and in Into the Pit, you can find Trash and the Gang in a dumpster. That is very clearly an Easter egg. But if you want to use them as evidence, which is fair, if you look at the image for more than 2 seconds, you can see what seems to be Helpy destroyed in the dumpster. And you remember Helpy, he's this little guy on your monitor. Why would he go on to later be repaired and then burned? It doesn't make sense. That literally means one thing. If these guys hold any narrative weight, their purpose is to imply that they're placed in the dumpster after Pizzeria Simulator. What's worse is that you can't even appeal to the Fright stories for help, because Jeff still owns the pizzeria well into the 8th and 9th epilogues. Like, Into the Pit includes minigames based on stories that very clearly occur after FNaF 3. Fetch, by definition, happens after Pizzeria Simulator, and Into the Pit itself implies that the Freddy's location featured in the Fetch minigame is the same Freddy's from Into the Pit, but in the Fetch story, the events take place in an abandoned Freddy's, as in before Jeff buys the building. So if that minigame shows Fetch happening at the Into the Pit Freddy's, and Fetch canonically happens after Pizzeria Simulator, then by definition, the events of Fetch occur before Into the Pit, which means Into the Pit has to happen after Pizzeria Simulator. So if a year is outright stated or heavily implied, like how Into the Pit is largely believed to take place around 2020 or 2021, and you start seeing so-called conflicting information with its timeline placement after FNaF 3 and Pizzeria Simulator because you think those two take place in 2023, the issue isn't the stories. The issue may be these preconceived assumptions about when FNaF 3 and Pizzeria Simulator actually happen. The singular reason people believe Into the Pit takes place before Pizzeria Simulator is because of the assumed 2023 date. That's it. Not because of narrative logic, not because of cause and effect, just the number 223. But, and this is a massive but, this is where I start to disagree with a lot of theorists. I genuinely think that's where the theorizing ends. That's it, case closed. But then I hear you asking, what about the security logbook? And that's where I have to stop you. Like, actually, I don't buy into the real value theory, but I know it's super tempting. That $16 coupon mentioned in the logbook leads you to the number 27. And yeah, that is weirdly convenient, especially because all of that is found on page 61, the very page where Mike says to go to find the real value. But here's the thing, none of those real value calculations work cleanly. Sure, they all somehow get you back to $27, but they also include cents every single time, except for one. If you assume the coupon was issued in January of 1994 and you adjust for inflation to specifically November of 2017, you get $27 exactly. Exactly. But obviously there are major problems with this theory, because with this calculation, it's implying FNaF 3 takes place in 2017, which is 30 years after 1987. And it's implying that the coupon was issued in January of 1994, which is totally weird in and of itself. But what's really detrimental to this theory is the October and November date. If you do the calculation again and plug it in for October of 2017, you get $26.99. It's only when you plug in for November that you get $27 exactly. That's a problem because FNaF 3 very clearly does not take place during November. The attraction itself is very clearly describing itself as a horror attraction, as in it's likely opening in October. But in the story What We Found, it suggests that it takes place between mid-September and early October. The story itself states that, quote, the first of the fall leaves skittered along the concrete in front of him as he walked. And we know the attraction burned down quite quickly, so it definitely cannot take place in November. So to me, I feel like that breaks the theory. It's just a reach. And if anything, the 9 and the 3 just so happens to give you the I in the Cassidy name puzzle. So that may just be it. But if I'm being brutally honest, there is technically one thing in the logbook that I think may help place FNaF 3 in the timeline. And it's dabbing Chica. Yes, I'm being serious. Dabbing was literally popular in 2015. That's when it exploded in popularity. So yeah, assuming we don't want to open that kind of worms, I'm sticking with Pizzeria Simulator taking place in 2017 at the latest. That keeps things clean, coherent, and even for once, kind of satisfying. But at the very least, I hope I've been able to cast some doubt on the community's assumptions and show how they're not all set in stone by any means. There's far more nuance to this than a lot of people realize. But yeah, that was my video. So if you guys really did like it, let me know. I have a lot more ideas that I want to share with people. But thanks for watching.